Book 4, Chapter 2 of The New Republic by William Hurrell Mallock. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Foon. We could really, Mr. Luke, almost fancy that we heard the sirens singing just now, said Mrs. Sinclair, when the ladies of the party had returned from their ramble on the shore, with Mr. Rose amongst them, like Apollo leading the Muses. The coloured lamps were now glowing brightly, with their green and purple clusters. The table was glittering under them, a wilderness of enchanted sparklings, and outside the moonlight was bathing everything, the roof and pillars of the pavilion, the myrtles, and the multitudes of crowding roses, which trembled just a little in the air that they themselves scented. "Yes," Mrs. Sinclair said, whilst there were some arrangements going on amongst the others with shawls and opera cloaks, "I never saw anything like the sea tonight. Far off, the spray amongst the rocks looked like mermaids playing, and at our feet it seemed as if the little pale waves were whispering and sighing messages to us. I don't think I should like to tell quite all I thought they said to me. And listen," she cried with a faint sigh, "is not that the nightingale? It is, I am certain it is. The same that oft times hath charmed magic casements opening on the foam of perilous seas in fairy lands forlorn. What a night it is, to be sure! We all felt down on the beach as if we were literally breathing in romance, or, well, I don't know what the right word is." "And I," said Mr. Rose, "have been explaining to them that, had they lived in any other age, they would have felt nothing of all this; that they feel it by virtue of senses that have only been acquired in ours." "Yes," said Mr. Luke, clearing his throat, "that's quite true, and I want now to try and explain clearly how and why it is true. I was particularly anxious," he said in a whisper to Laurence as he drew his chair forward, "to speak of this when your Roman Catholic friend was here, as she seems a very intelligent young lady, and is, I have no doubt, fully alive to some of the grotesquenesses of what she considers to be her creed." Mr. Luke resettled himself. On one side of him was Miss Merton, in a pale blue opera cloak, bordered with white fur, and embroidered with gold, something in her large eyes of a subdued sadness; and on the other side was Mrs. Sinclair, all in white, who looked like a wood anemone against a background of dark foliage. "Now," Mr. Luke continued, raising his voice a little, but speaking with a more mellow persuasiveness than usual, "we all of us feel, in a general way, I think I may say that we nearly all of us feel, that the cultured minority of the present age is endowed with feelings, sentiments, and powers of insight, not only in advance of its common contemporaries, but in advance of all preceding times. We understand natural beauty, and natural affections, and above all, moral beauty, in a new way all our own. Now, to what is the advance due? It is all due to culture in its highest connection, its connection with religion. We feel stronger emotions about natural scenery, for just the same reason that we feel stronger emotions about righteousness. And the reason is that our emotions in either case no longer tempt us to draw grotesque inferences from themselves. There's the whole heart of the matter. We rest gratefully content with the objects that excite our love. We don't pass away beyond them and forget them. You had an excellent instance of the old treatment I condemn in those verses of Euripides which Mr. Laurence has translated with so much tenderness. There, you see, you have nature, flowers, meadows, and so forth, and, more important still, you have a high conception of virtue. But yet, in that poem you have no real feeling for either the flowers or the virtue. the feeling only grazes these, so to speak, and glances off to a shadowy deity beyond, who was no more true, no more verifiable than any of the rest of her kind, male or female, singular or triple. And now, Mr. Luke went on, turning to Miss Merton, here is another illustration of the whole thing, of the advance made by culture in our entire mental state, of which in particular I wanted to talk to you. For in one point at least we agree, even professedly, the doctrine of development. And this is an illustration of it that you, in a special way, will appreciate. You, of course, said Mr. Luke, know something more or less about St. Augustine, I suppose. As it was with her reading that father's account of his conversion that Miss Merton in a peculiar way associated her own, she looked at Mr. Luke with increased interest, feeling at the same time that she had certainly as much knowledge on the subject as he so generously gave her credit for. Well, Mr. Luke went on, Augustine was on the whole, you know, the most cultured of all the fathers, and considering the early date at which he lived, had in some way a real insight into Christianity, so we may safely consider him as the most favourable specimen of the results of the old system. Let us take then the purest and most elevating of all the pleasures of life, and inquire, through him, how it is treated and looked upon by theological Christianity. The eyes, says Augustine, love fair and various forms, and shining and lovely colours, and all day long they are before me and solicit my contemplation. For, and this exquisite sentence I remember in his very words, the light, that queen of colours, bathing all that we can look upon, from morning till evening, let me go where I will still keep gliding by me in unnumbered guises, and soothes me whilst I am busy at other things, and am thinking nothing of her. Miss Merton was pleased at the appreciative tone in which Mr. Luke quoted. Mr. Luke noticed this, and he was pleased also. And now, he continued, what return does our gentleman make to the light for its beautiful and constant service to him? Does he thank it? Does he praise it? Does he seek it? No. Mr. Luke here gave a little laugh. Not a bit of it. He prays to his God that he may be delivered from its insidious snares. He envies the blindness of Tobit, and describes himself as earnestly groaning under the temptations of these eyes of his flesh. That is all. There, said Mr. Luke, with a confident appeal to Miss Merton, whose expression was now slightly altering. We have in a most pointed form the barbarizing result of the old theological religion. And now, put side by side with this, the following expression of the religion of sweet reason, such as culture reveals it to us. It deals with exactly the same sense and the same pleasures. What soul was his, when from the naked top of some bold headland he beheld the sun rise up and bathe the world in light? He looked, ocean and earth, the solid frame of earth, and ocean's liquid mass beneath him lay in gladness and deep joy. The clouds were touched, and in their silent faces could be read unutterable love. Sound needed none, nor any voice of joy. His spirit drank the spectacle. Sensation, soul, and form all melted into him. They swallowed up his animal being. In them did he live, and by them did he live. They were his life. In such access of mind, in such high hour of visitation from the living God, thought was not. In enjoyment it expired. No thanks he breathed. He proffered no request. A sudden sigh here escaped from someone. Mr. Luke looked round. Ah, exclaimed Mr. Stockton, what a description of prayer! What a noble, what a magnificent description! The fashion of Mr. Luke's countenance changed. He stopped short, he would not proceed a word farther. His whole quotation had been ruined, he felt, by this odious interruption. "I never supposed," said Miss Merton, who thought Mr. Luke pausing that she might give in her acquiescence, "I never supposed St. Augustine's views quite final upon all matters. I dare say there are some things that even I could have taught him." She smiled as she said this, but there was a little embarrassment in her tone which was perceived by Laurence, and which brought him at once to her rescue. "I," he said, "think the contrast Mr. Luke has drawn even stronger than he has made it. I by no means think that Augustine was afraid of the pleasures of light and sight as they were enjoyed by Wordsworth; for I can hardly fancy that he could have had the least conception of them. They seem to me to have a new and peculiar heritage, which we may all more or less have part in, but which by former ages were undreamt of, not rejected. I often myself look back on a certain early walk I took one spring morning in these gardens, amongst the very trees and flower beds we are now looking out upon. The fresh softness that was in the air, and all the wandering scents, like dreams or prophecies of summers gone or coming, and the wet light glistening on the dewy leaves, seemed to go at once to the soul, to melt into me, as into Wordsworth's herdsman. Once I surprised myself stooping under a dripping bough to look upwards at a yellow flower and watch it lonely against the background of blue sky; and once I started to find myself quite lost in staring at a red rock gleaming amongst shrubs and ivy, which a plant of periwinkle spangled with a constellation of purple stars. The colour, the shape, the smell of every leaf and flower, each seemed to touch me like a note of music, and the bloom of morning mist was over everything." "Ah," said Mrs. Sinclair, her dark eyes gleaming in the moonlight, "how those spring mornings sometimes make one sick with longing." "Yes," said Laurence, "with longing, with a vague longing, not always, I am afraid, with thanksgiving or with praise. But I think the feeling in all its moods is the same in some ways. It is a mixing together of outward and inward things; our whole inward lives passing out of us into nature; nature melting into us, and growing part of our inward lives, so that all our hopes and fears and memories become embodied things, touching us in scents of flowers, in the breath of the air, in the sparkle of water, or mixing, like hamadryads, their beings with the trees. Now, could I have described such feelings as these, my own state of mind, during my morning walk, to St. Augustine, he would not have understood me. He would have thought me raving; and my case is not peculiar. These feelings are no private things of my own. They belong to our whole age. And of this," Laurence went on, "you may see a very curious proof in a part of our modern literature, which as literature is least successful. I mean, a certain class of novels, not the works of the greater novelists, still less the works of the professional novel manufacturers. Not these, but a sort of production almost peculiar to our own time. The novels of amateurs, who write perhaps but a single book during their whole lives, and that one with the simple aim of pouring out their own feelings for themselves to contemplate, or of explaining to themselves or others their own histories." "And so," said Mr. Storks, "you would gauge the refinement of the age by its silliest novels?" "I think we too often forget," said Laurence, "that a very silly book may be evidently the work of a very clever person, and may show its author possessed of every gift except that of literature. And in many of the poor novels I am speaking of, the utter failure of the expression often only calls our attention more strongly to the depth, the delicacy, and the refinement of what the writer has struggled to express. I was reading a girl's novel in the train the other day, called Love in a Life. Its long spasms of ungrammatical verbiage, its utter want of knowledge of the world, would have turned the dullest reviewer, in spite of himself, into a caustic wit. But there was a something all through it that its authoress was trying to utter, that reminded me of Ariel trying to escape from his tree. What, Lady Ambrose, have you written a novel? No? Then why are you looking so mysterious, and so full of meaning? Go on, Mr. Lawrence, said Lady Ambrose. I'll show you by and by. Well, said Lawrence, take any one of these novels, and you will find the writer looking on nature in just that peculiar modern way that we have been talking of. I don't say you will always find the sentiment in the books, but the books will show you that you would find it in the writers. And this feeling about nature is but an example of others. Take, as I said, the modern conception of love, and study that too, in these foolish novels. You will find half the folly comes from an attempt to express much, not from success in expressing little. A pause followed this. It was broken at last by Alan. I quite agree with Mr. Lawrence, he said diffidently. I have not much right to judge, I dare say. I'm not a great reader, and I can only speak from books. But still, I know a little of the love poetry of this and of other times, and the poetry of this has always seemed to me far, far the highest. It has seemed to me to give the passions so much more meaning, and such a much greater influence over all life. And this, I suppose, must be because men, as the world goes on, are really learning to love in a higher way than perhaps they themselves are often conscious of. I think some philosopher, murmured Mrs. Sinclair to Leslie, says we feel that we are greater than we know. It must be a great comfort sometimes to know that we are greater than we feel. Is it not Novalis, went on Alan, who says that if all the human race were a single pair of lovers, the difference between mysticism and non-mysticism would cease? Would that have been understood even 100 years ago? But as to poets, I was thinking of two English poets of our own day especially. Shakespeare may of course have exhibited the working of love more powerfully than they, yet I am sure he could never have conceived its meaning and its nature so deeply. No heroine of his could have understood Mrs. Browning's Sonnets from the Portuguese, nor any hero of his her husband's love lyrics. What seems to me the thing so peculiarly modern is this notion of love as something which, once truly attained, would, as Browning says, make time break, letting us pent-up creatures through into eternity our due. Ah, murmured Mrs. Sinclair. But suppose there is no eternity? I think we had better take what we can, and be thankful. Listen again. The nightingales, the nightingales. There, Lord Allen, there is a bit of your Mrs. Browning for you. What, Lord Allen? Said Lady Ambrose. And is Mr. Robert Browning a better poet than Shakespeare? I always thought Shakespeare was quite our best. It is not a question, said Lawrence, as Allen did not speak, of different poets, but of different ages. I have often wondered myself how far Faust would have appealed to the author of Hamlet, and whether all the spiritual action of the drama, in so far as it relates to the heroine, might not be lost upon him. What a difference between Margaret and Ophelia, not between themselves, but between the parts they play. Shakespeare himself might have understood Margaret's influence. I doubt it. But even if he had, that would prove little. Shakespeare's was the prophetic soul of the wide world dreaming on things to come. And the wide world of his time would itself have understood nothing of it. But what strikes me still more than the growth of particular feelings is the infusion and the interpenetration of all. Look at Shakespeare's sonnets. He loved the objects they were addressed to. He loved flowers and nature. But these two sets of things were connected only in his mind, they were not fused. Take, however, that most typical of all modern poems, the celebrated love song in Maud, and think of that. The slender acacia would not shake one long milk bloom on the tree. The white lake blossom fell into the lake, and the pimpernel dozed on the lea. But the rose was awake all night for your sake, knowing your promise to me. The lilies and roses were all awake, they sighed for the dawn and thee. What a passion is there! We almost hear the lover's pulses as they painfully beat quicker. Our breath catches with his, and we long and long with his longing. And yet hardly a word about his feelings is said directly. The secret is echoed back to us from the scene and from the summer night. It is the milk bloom of the acacia, the musk of the roses, the stir of the morning breeze, that tells it all to us as if they were living things, and as if a human passion had passed into them for a soul. Now, would the world have understood this in any other times but ours? I don't think even Shakespeare's Jessica would, nor Dante's Beatrice, nor Petrarch's Laura, nor Horace's Lydia, nor Plato's Diotima, nor Homer's Helen. "Listen," exclaimed Mr. Rose eagerly, as soon as Laurence stopped. "Will you let me read one passage out of my work which bears upon this very point, in fact, sums up exactly what you have been saying? It occurs," said Mr. Rose, who was sitting ready under one of the lamps with some printer's proofs before him, "in my Essay on Capacity. But chief, this is the passage I mean, but chief amongst the new things which the heart of man has come to the understanding of, is the passion of love in its distinctly modern form. The goddess of this love is no longer the Aphrodite of the Greeks, or the Mary of the Christians. She is a mysterious hybrid being, in whose veins is the blood of both of them. She is Mary in her desire of the Creator. She is Aphrodite in her desire of the creature. And in her desire of the creation, she is also Artemis." "Oh, this will never do! This will never do!" muttered Dr. Jenkinson to himself, tapping with his feet on the ground. "Into the strange passion," Mr. Rose went on, "of which hers is the tutelage, there have melted the sounds of woods and of waters, and the shapes and the hues of mountains, and the savour of airs and winds, and the odours of all flowers. All the joys indeed of the senses have fallen into it, like streams into one sea. And with the joys of the spirit it has been likewise. But whereas the senses have contributed their joys mainly, the spirit has contributed its sorrows and pains as well. Throughout this love, despite its fullness of life, there yet runs also a constant taint of death, of which it needs cleansing. Grotesque troubles and misgivings of conscience, and cloistral meditations, and fantastic repentances. For this very reason, however, is it the more wholly expressive to us of the man's inner development. It shows us how all his desires, senses, and powers of feeling have been growing together, and coalescing into a single organism, capable of quite new sets of pleasures, and responding to far finer movements from without." Said Mr. Luke slowly, in a tone of meditative commendation. "There's a great deal of truth in that, a very great deal. If the fellow," he added to himself, "would only put it a little better." "Are you quite sure," said Dr. Jenkinson, looking round him in an agony of suppressed irritation, "that anyone at all feels all these things, beyond the very few people who talk about them?" Yes, said Mr. Rose, smiling with a honeyed gravity, and wholly unconscious of the doctor's animus. All feel thus who have any part or lot in the world's development. You, said the doctor, turning sharply away from Mr. Rose, think so, Lawrence, don't you, because you find some of the same sort of phrases in novels? I don't think you'll find very much thought in those novels. Not very much. They are effeminate, foolish books. Yes, said Alan, with an assenting voice that much pleased the doctor. A great deal of this increased depth and refinement of feeling, I know, is very good. All of it, I dare say, may be. But still, if left to itself, it must tend, indeed I have often seen it tend, to make men effeminate, as Dr. Jenkinson says, and unfit for work. Now, I dare say Mr. Luke will call me a barbarian, but I am going to venture to say that, in spite of all that is said against it, that barbarous thing, sport, shooting, deer-stalking, hunting, is of great value, especially to people who are not barbarians, as a kind of mental tonic. It makes them active and spirited. It must do so. It gives them presence of mind, and a readiness to exert themselves. And though sport may in one sense be a self-indulgence, it is a self-indulgence that is constantly teaching all sorts of self-denial. My dear Lord Alan, said Mr. Luke, I most entirely agree with you. It does seem, I admit, at first sight, a somewhat singular thing, that the result of the latest civilization should be to give men leisure to return to the occupations of their earliest barbarism, and those too deprived of their one justification, necessity. But still these barbarous sports must, as you say, if not pursued too exclusively, give a valuable moral tone to minds whose refinement might else become weakness. Only the worst of the matter, as it actually stands, is this, that the majority of people who do follow sport are the very people who have no refinement that needs strengthening, but merely an idle, aimless strength that needs refining. And you must remember, Lord Alan, that the man who is gluttonous of aimless bodily action is no better than the man who is an epicure in aimless mental emotion. And so, said Donald Gordon, with devout solemnity, this is what we must remedy in our new republic. Our gentlemen there must have both sides of their nature developed equally, and they must be at once so intellectual and so manly as to be content that partridges and foxes shall die exclusively for them, without their living exclusively for partridges and foxes. Exactly so, said Mr. Luke dryly. Someone observed this afternoon, said Alan, turning a little stiffly to Donald Gordon, how one could see the expression of a girl's face changed by the influence of a little genuine mental culture. I have noticed the same thing in men's faces, under the influence of a little genuine bodily culture. And I think myself that the moors of your country, or a river in Norway, or a good cruise in a yacht, may go, well, at least half as far towards making a complete man, as the study of books and art and poetry in an armchair or in a picture gallery. I think that is so true, said Miss Merton softly to him in a whisper, for Dr. Jenkinson had begun to speak. But, the doctor was saying, you must want something besides looking at pretty scenery, and falling in love and shooting. I think you want something besides that to make life complete. You will want to exercise your intellect, your reason. Yes, said Alan, and I defend all this voluntary physical exercise and excitement, because I think it makes the mind even more healthy than it does the body. Yes, said Dr. Jenkinson with a smile, I think that's right. You, gentlemen, interposed Lady Grace, seem to be taking very good care of yourselves. But are we women to shoot and take all this exercise also?" "That," said Mr. Luke with a courtly smile, "we defer to your superior wisdom. There are, however, two helps to education, akin to exercise, in which both sexes will share, and which in a perfect state of society would be most important in their results. I mean travelling, and the halving of our lives between town and country. The completeness, the many-sidedness of such culture as there is amongst us, is in a great measure due to these, but it is only slowly that we are learning to use them properly. Of course, Jenkinson, you understand all this. No man can do so better. It is simply the music and gymnastic of the Greeks. It is simply true education, which is but another name for culture. And in the cultivated man, thought and taste and feeling and spirit are really all one, and fused together. Could we but look forward to a time when all, or even the greater part of those one meets, would unite these priceless gifts, there might then indeed be some satisfaction and some hope in life." "And don't you want goodness?" said Dr. Jenkinson, all his sharpness returning. "Do you want no sense of duty and right and wrong?" "Yes," said Laurence. "But we have included that already. We have found that that is presupposed in every educated pleasure. It is that gives even our lightest conversation its best sparkle, and beads its surface over with its bright, crisp foam of half-conscious irony. The moral ideal is a note, as it were, which we are always hearing, and with which our daily talk makes continual harmonies, because it is never pitched in unison with it. Thus we talk of killing time and so on, as being the great end of our lives, of money or position being the only thing to marry for, and of marriage ties as if they were always a weariness or a grotesque torture." "And thus," said Leslie, "we say a man has had, par excellence, a success, when he has, for his own selfish pleasure, done a woman the greatest injury possible." "And thus," said Donald Gordon softly, "when he does not tell all the world he has done so, we say he is a perfect gentleman." "And do you want no religion?" said Dr. Jenkinson, paying no attention to all this, but again turning to Mr. Luke. "My dear Jenkinson," said Mr. Luke, "you and I agree upon these matters so well, that I think you must be trying to misunderstand us. Can religion and morals be separated? And are they not both included in what we mean by culture? Is it not in virtue of culture, that nice and complex discrimination, that we can tell at once when we come across a genuine logion of Jesus amongst the sayings vulgarly supposed to be most distinctive of him? Think, for instance," Mr. Luke continued, "what a beautiful and profound harmony is at once made amongst our heartstrings, if culture have really tuned them, by such a story as that of the woman taken in adultery, or by the parable of the prodigal son, or by such simple pregnant sayings as ipago ke erhomai prosimas, and then turn for a moment to the theological accounts of the Trinity. Why," exclaimed Mr. Luke with a sudden jauntiness, "to sit on the keyboard of an organ would make music compared to the discord, the jangling, the string-breaking, that church catechisms and Athanasian creeds and episcopal speculations on the personality of the Creator make on the musical instrument of the cultured mind. Ah," Mr. Luke continued, "could the founder of Christianity only have found men of more culture as his immediate disciples and reporters, could he only have secured a biographer as simply honest as poor Boswell was— well, but it's no use speculating about what might have been. Religion has had bad times hitherto, but now at last some of us at least, are seeing the way to make them better. You yourself, Jenkinson, amongst the number. And all this is due to that very thing which we say is the essence of the best human life — culture. Culture which is neither religion, nor morality, nor taste, nor intellect, nor knowledge, nor wide reading, but the single result of all. And this, Mr. Luke added, showing itself to the full, doing itself complete justice through, as our friends have already said, what we call polish and high breeding, and refinement of manner, and of manners. Surely you, said Mr. Stockton, turning to Dr. Jenkinson with the most mollifying deference, must agree with us that the present century has seen the soul of man widening out, with all its marvellous powers, and displaying new riches of beauty like an unfolding flower. But whilst we value, and none can value more than I, our higher flights of imagination, our finer forms of love and poetry and worship, I am not blind to the great agent that is at the bottom of all this change. I mean the emancipated human intellect, with all its manifold apparatus of discovery and conquest, that great liberator of life and thought and religion. There is some truth in that, said Dr. Jenkinson, not ungraciously. But I think you are all putting it in a wrong way. And, Luke, he added with a little more causticity, to understand Christianity, you must know something of other religions too. You must study the great religions of the East, and compare them with those of the West. No religion can be understood by its own light only. In our ideal city, said Mr. Rose, as I saw it in my brief apocalypse, you will find a home and a temple for every creed, and for every form of worship. What? Exclaimed Lady Ambrose. Does Dr. Jenkinson want us to introduce Juggernaut and his car into England? May I ask you one question? Broke in Mr. Herbert suddenly. A question which at times, I confess, seems to me not without importance. Will this religion of yours, as you told us in the afternoon it was based on the discrimination between good and evil, also involve a discrimination between life and death? Will it, I mean, point to any other life beyond this, or will it not? Is whatever evil and sorrow we patiently suffer a thing which, if it do not bring its reward to us here, will never bring us any reward at all? And shall we call the death of the noble sufferer blessed for no other reason than that he rests from his labours and his works do not follow him? Dear me, said Dr. Jenkinson petulantly to himself. These sort of questions ought never to be asked in that hard, abrupt way. You can't answer them. You can't answer them. Mr. Stockton, however, found no difficulty with his answer. As to that, he said, each man would think as he pleased, and his thoughts would shape themselves to meet the deepest needs of his life. In the state of society we long for, the belief in a future life would be open to all to accept or to reject. The only thing to guard against would be any definite public opinion on the matter, one way or the other. For in any definite public opinion, remember, there is the germ of all dogmatism and of all persecution. Public opinion, in society as it ought to be, would be a frictionless fluid, if I may borrow a metaphor from science, in which no adventitious obstacle from prejudice or otherwise would impede the progress of any view that its own merits set in motion. Mr. Luke was certainly an unfortunate man. Mr. Stockton had again, in part at least, expressed the exact thing which in other words he was going to have said himself. Mr. Luke, however, did not flinch. He boldly took the bull by the horns. True, he said, that metaphor is ingenious, and explains exactly what we want to explain. That is one of the great conditions of a truly cultivated society, what Mr. Stockton calls a frictionless public opinion. A public opinion which shall let every system, every creed, every philosophy of life stand or fall on its own practical verifiable merits. And this we shall get too, if we can only banish two things, prejudice and ignorance, of which last, Mr. Luke added, looking studiously away from Mr. Stockton, by far the deadliest form is the fetish worship of useless knowledge. Well, said Miss Merton, I suppose that this is all that any of us would ask, who really and truly believe in what we profess to believe. Of course it is, said Mr. Luke. Everything. Everything. And I'm quite sure, said Lady Grace, that in a society where the tone is so nobly liberal, and where all have such a true and burning admiration of the morally beautiful, it will be quite impossible that woman's life shall not be seen to be what it really is, a thing as capable as men's of high aims, and independent purposes, and not, as it were, entirely sunk in theirs. I, Mr. Luke, in face of such a public opinion as you speak of, should have little fear for our cause. I think, under God, it would prosper there. Of course it would, said Mr. Luke. If culture enables us to detect beauty and to prize it, what should it enable us to prize more than womanhood, with all its exquisite capabilities developed to their utmost? Life has no greater ornament than cultured womanhood. Except cultured manhood, said Lady Grace, unconsciously giving Mr. Luke a slight wound by her generous and unexpected return of his royal compliment. Ah, she sighed to herself with a look at Mr. Luke. And he does not believe in God, or thinks he does not. I suppose it must needs be that offences come, but I wish they did not come by such good men. However, I trust that it is all really for the best. And then, there is no such thing as eternal punishment. One may be thankful to feel sure of that. I am afraid you will think me very troublesome, said Mr. Herbert, who had been talking to Lawrence in a low tone for the last few minutes. But there is one question more I should like to ask you. I want to know if you, who see the many delicate beauties of life, and the countless positions it may be viewed from, I want to know if you will teach the lower, the commoner classes, who look up to you as models, to quote poetry, and to be inquiring and sceptical also. I hope not indeed, broke in Lady Ambrose with vigour. And as to our being their models, Mr. Herbert, I'm sure you can't mean that. It seems to me one of the very worst things in these times that they will take us for their models. However, I think it is really a good deal our fault, and that it comes very much from our giving our maids so many of our old clothes to wear. That sort of thing puts notions into their heads. Now, here at any rate is one reform that is implied in our republic. I don't like that word republic, by the way. We must put a stop to all this imitation of ourselves. Isn't that so, Mr. Lawrence? Thank you, Lady Ambrose, said Mr. Herbert, rising. Thank you. I think it altogether a wise, nay, more than wise, an essential thing, to keep these wide speculations from spreading beyond the only circles that they are really fitted for. I have to go indoors now, as I have a few matters to arrange tonight, but I am much obliged to you all for what you have taught me about culture and enlightenment and society, as it ought to be. The difficulty is, said Lady Ambrose, as Mr. Herbert was walking away, how to keep all this thought, and so forth, to ourselves. One thing I'm quite certain of, that we really do a great deal of harm without thinking of it, by the way in which we speak our minds out before servants, and that sort of people, without in the least considering what may come of it. Now, what do you think of this, as a plan for making our ideal state a really good and contented place? The upper classes should speak a different language from the lower classes. Of course, we should be able to speak theirs, but they would not be able to speak ours. And then, you see, they would never hear us talk or read our books or get hold of our ideas, which, after all, is what does all the mischief. And yet, said Lady Ambrose with a sigh, that's not the great difficulty. The great difficulty would be about daughters and younger sons, and how to give them all enough to keep them going in the world. However, this we can talk of in a minute. But here Lady Ambrose put her hand in her pocket, and a sound was heard as of rustling paper. "I really do believe," said Laurence, "that Lady Ambrose has written a novel, although she denies it, and there she is going to read a bit of it now, as a specimen of her own culture." "No," said Lady Ambrose, "really and truly. And if I had written a novel, Mr. Laurence, I should not have the cruelty to inflict it upon you. No, but what I have here," she said at last, producing a manuscript, "though it is not mine, is next door to a novel, and in some respects better than one. It is a sort of memoir of herself, written by a certain lady I know. I am betraying no confidence in showing it to you, as she herself has lent it to a good many friends, and as long as her name is not mentioned, she is by way of wishing to have it circulated. She has, in fact, consulted me about having it printed. Now, I want you, Mr. Laurence, to look through some of it, and tell me if the writer is not really a person of culture. Perhaps you would not mind reading out a little of it." "Am I to read it all through?" asked Laurence, as he took the seat which Mr. Rose gave up to him at the table. "No, no," said Lady Ambrose. "Just pick out the best bits, a page here and a page there." "Well," said Laurence, "I will, at any rate, start with the beginning. Now, are all of us ready to be let into the secrets of a young lady's soul? One often feels a longing, who has not felt it, in the hurry and trouble of life to pause for a little while and look back upon the past, which we too often forget, and see what it is we have grown from. We long to see how it has fared with ourselves, our own selves, our characters." "I think you may skip the beginning," said Lady Ambrose. "It's a little dull. Turn over a page or two." "How strangely do they come back to me, those distant, irrevocable days? Will that do?" asked Laurence. "Yes," said Lady Ambrose. "I think so. Go on there." "Those distant, irrevocable days, when the world was all new to me, and each experience was fresh and delightful, and I knew nothing of what self-reproach could mean. Ah me! How times have changed since then! I sometimes fancy that I am hardly worthy now to look back upon my own past. I was gifted naturally with a curious warmth and sincerity of nature that must have been very beautiful. But my peculiar gift, my own gift, was a power of sympathy with others, by which quite naturally I used to throw myself into their places, understand their difficulties, and excite myself with their interests. When I was yet quite a child, that, I know, is what man felt in me. I never cared for boys. One man especially. It was then that life began for me, and what it all meant broke on me like a revelation. I, in my simplicity, never dreamt of his being more than a friend. I'm not sure even that he was my dearest friend. I certainly never tried to charm him. But I did charm him, nevertheless, quite unconsciously. And he loved me passionately, devotedly, child as I was. Ah, God! When will another ever feel the same for me? And oh, my lost, rejected friend, come back to me. Sometimes I still cry in my solitude. Poor and obscurely connected as you are, come back to me. I shall never forget, poor little me, the solemn shock of the moment, how my heart stood still, how all the blood came rushing into my cheek, when all of a sudden, as it seemed to me, and without any warning, he asked me to be his wife. Everything seemed to grow dizzy before me. It seemed to me as if the day of judgment had come. Alas, will there ever be a day of judgment at all, is what I now ask. I don't know what I said. I only remember distinctly my throwing myself into my mother's arms and crying like a child, and I was one, as if my very heart would break. I am only a child, that is what I said. Oh, mother, I am such a child. The pathos of the scene often comes back to me even now, a shadowy, timid memory, wondering if I shall give it harbour. I remember too how I said my prayers that night, and how I asked God. "I think you needn't read that," said Lady Ambrose. "Go on a page or two further." "I spent much of my time sketching." "Shall I go on there?" said Lawrence. "I had always a curiously appreciative eye for natural beauty." "Will that do? Or shall I go on here? I think this is better. At the next paragraph. Oh, the great waste of love in this our world." "Yes, go on there," said Mrs. Sinclair and several others. "Oh, the great waste of love in this our world. How many a true heart would have given itself to me, could I only honestly and unreservedly have opened out to it all the depths of mine, and received it. And why did I never do so? It may be that I have known none who could really understand me, none that I could really love. But does that excuse me, not for not loving them, but for making as though I did love them, and so ruining their lives and searing my own? Sending them in the end to their brandy bottles, and their gaming hells, and their wild cremorns, and myself to the mental state in which I am now? Have I then lost it forever, lost all hope of love, and must I quietly take up with my unappreciated loneliness? If it is so, if indeed it is so, surely I have brought it on myself. Was there not one, not my earliest lover, but another, who, with a devotion I understood far more fully, laid himself at my feet, and offered me all his man's devotion, and his man's sympathy? Why in my madness did I send him from me, penniless as he was? But what of that? Driving him to death, and leaving myself to desolation. How does the image of his pale still face upturned towards the Indian starlight, with eyes which no starlight could ever touch any more, rise before me? His hand on his breast, and clasping with its last grasp a locket with my picture in it. Yes, I see him there, though I did not see him. I know how he must have looked, with his heart bullet-pierced, noble, beautiful in death. Unworthy as I was of you, my true-hearted one, too late did I learn my own unworthiness. I was sitting in the window of our house at Ventnor, when the letter came that told me. It was evening, and I had been looking out through the summer twilight at the sea and at the sunset. As I read the letter, it dropped from my hand. I gave a gasp. I repressed a shrill cry. I felt a choking sensation in my throat, but I was very proud, and I even repressed a sob. I only, with entire calmness, turned my head towards the sea, and sighed a sigh deep-drawn as if my soul were in it. My cheek was pale, my eyes were wild and wistful, full of a solemn new earnestness. What the exact thoughts were that were busy in me, I cannot tell. All I am conscious of was this, that far, far off were the great crimson spaces of evening sky and a trail of rippled splendor on the sea. One great violet cloud fringed with a border of living fire that seemed to be eating into it, hung just above the place where the sun had gone down, and over this, in a pale liquid solitude of hushed colour, was the evening star, trembling like a teardrop. I was always sensitive to colour, and somehow or other this sunset relieved me, went right to my heart with a quiet sense of healing. That evening was, I think, one of the great points in my life. I seemed ever after to see my own character more clearly. How deep were my own capacities for feeling, and also how strangely nature could enter in and comfort me, when all human sympathy would have seemed intrusive. That night when I went upstairs I hardly knew myself. There was a wild look in my eyes, an inexpressible mournfulness and an inexpressible longing. 2 or 3 long tendrils of hair had got loose, and hung over my forehead with a kind of wild languor. What is there that men can see in me to attract them? I had often said to myself. I think then a something of what it was began to dawn upon me. And he, the true, the gallant, the devoted, he has lost all this, I gasped, turning away from the glass. And throwing myself on my knees by the bed, the sob I had so long suppressed broke forth, and I tried to pray. And so on, and so on, and so on. You needn't read all those bits about the prayers, said Lady Ambrose. I don't think it's quite reverent. Well, said Lawrence, here's a new stage of our life. Let us go on here. And now, from the bleak desolation of my present existence, I peer wistfully out on all sides and see if any will bring the love to me that I so much crave for. Poor thing, cried Mrs. Sinclair, with a little sigh. I'm afraid, said Lady Ambrose, I must mention, by the way, that the lady is married, and remarkably well married too. Here, in the old house, with its quiet gables, Lawrence went on reading, I sit in my own room and watch the sunset dying away over the yellowing autumn woods, itself the colour of a belated autumn leaf. I watch it alone. Yes, thank heaven, alone. I manage to steal for an hour or two away from those people of whom the house is full. Who is there amongst them that can understand me? Whose spirit meets mine on equal terms? I laugh with them, I talk with them, I jest with them, and they think they know me. But the weariness, the far-offness of it all! It is entirely her own fault, said Lady Ambrose, that she has these people here. Her husband is devoted to the country and to turnips for their own sake, and would never see a soul but a few of the neighbouring squires and parsons, if she did not make him. In London, you know, she is nearly always by herself. At least, Lady Ambrose added, he's very rarely with her. A little further on, said Lawrence, it seems that all the visitors have gone, and she has been to pay a visit to the parson's wife. You may be sure she was quite by herself if she did that, said Lady Ambrose. Here, Lawrence continued, is a description of the visit. What sweet eyes the little thing had! What a look of trustfulness in her face! A good and pure, and therefore a happy woman, if ever there was one. What a trust in those eyes of hers! What an innocence! What a sweet content! There is no purple shadow of care under her eyes. People say I darken mine artificially. Alas, heaven knows there is little need for me to do that. There is no secret trouble discernible in her lips, no languor in her air. What does she know of life, with its troubles, its distractions, its sins? Ah, were I but like her, I, world-worn and world-weary, sickened with pomps, and vanities, and soiled affections, and hollow homage, were I but worthy that she should talk to me. Don't talk to me, I felt inclined to say. You wouldn't if you knew, if you could know. Oh, how far better are you than I! You little dream, when I show myself demurely in my seat in the village church, bowing at the glorias, or kneeling with my face hid in my hands, you little imagine what a woman you see there. You little dream what strange thoughts unbidden mix themselves up for me with the hymn music. What wild regrets, what bitter reveries, what strange scenes and figures fill my mind as I kneel before the communion table. Why could I not have been content like you with a quiet lot, a toiling honest husband like you? Is there not something holy even in his dull sermons, if you only look on them in the lovely light of duty? Why does my heart vibrate with the troubled, wailing music of many sorrows, many longings, of which you do not even dream the existence? Oh, what a far higher, far nobler woman are you than I, in every way! And now, said Lady Ambrose, seeing that Laurence had shut the book, I want to know if all this is a specimen of culture, and if you would call the writer a cultivated person. Because she is really one of the most delightful people I know to talk to. And if this is what you call culture, though I think in her case it's a little bit affected, you know, but then she never lets you see all this when you talk to her. I do quite from the bottom of my heart give up about culture being priggish and bookish and all that. And since, as you say, it really must include religion, I don't see what we could wish for more to make life, humanly speaking, perfect. Of course, we shall do good sometimes. I mean, not forget the poor. There's something so wretchedly heartless in that, I think. And then, too, politics. Yes, repeated Alan, politics. Of course, said Lady Ambrose, it is necessary that some of us should look after politics, because if we did not, somebody else would. But still— Are you a Liberal, Lord Alan? But still, within a limit, I think the less we meddle, the better. Much, Lady Ambrose, said Mr. Rose, who had been somewhat put out by this digression. Much is, no doubt, to be got over in your friend's style, nor do I think the culture displayed in her memoirs, even apart from that— Oh, but you mustn't judge her only by her writings, said Lady Ambrose. When you meet her, she is not a bit like them. Amateurs in writing rarely are, said Laurence. Their writings are simply the footnotes of their lives, where they tell you what they have not skill enough to bring into the text. She draws beautifully, Lady Ambrose went on, and is really the brightest of creatures, so witty and with such a sense of the ridiculous. And really to hear her tell a bit of scandal— not that I at all approve of scandal myself— I always think it so uncharitable. Ah, said Donald Gordon gently, I have the very highest opinion of scandal. It is founded on the most sacred of things, that is, truth, and it is built up by the most beautiful of things, that is, imagination. Well, Mr. Gordon, said Lady Ambrose, smiling, we won't talk about that now. But as for what you say about style, Mr. Rose, it is rather jerky and so forth, I admit. However, that's the way with us women. Indeed, I often think that if women had invented language, it would have consisted mainly of interjections, and that its only stop would have been a note of exclamation. Mr. Rose was much annoyed at these interruptions. I wanted to say, he went on, as soon as Lady Ambrose had ceased, that I think your friend's memoirs more instructive from their very shortcomings, as showing how the human mind, even if not exceptionally gifted, has come to be an organism of increased delicacy and capacity, except when stunted by the necessity of work, or of occupation that is other than voluntary, and chosen for any object beyond itself. You have here, you see, that same modern sense of the blending together of the outer and inner worlds. There is the same delicate discrimination between the aesthetic aspects of the different stages of life, and the nice gradation of moral colours. There is the same fine self-consciousness, and consequent endeavour to give tone and quality to her memories as they pass by her, in exquisite and complex ways. "Yes," exclaimed Leslie suddenly, who had spoken but little all the evening. "Here, I think, is the crowning work of culture. It teaches each of us to look back upon his own life, with all its wants, its relations, and its possibilities, all its wasted hours and its affections trifled away or degraded. It teaches us to look back upon all this with quite a new kind of discrimination. The beauty of youth, with all its buoyancy and innocence, wakes in us of the modern world a more wistful and solemn regret. We are more keenly alive to the pathos of failure, to the sadness of the cold shadows that will often darken the whole inward landscape, and the ravage made by the storms that will sometimes break over it, and to the gleams of sunshine fitfully reappearing, often only touching its distant wolds. And the charm of this is," Leslie went on, with a short laugh, "that however disastrous our lives may have been, whatever shipwreck we have made of ourselves or others, let us only look back on this with the eyes of culture, whilst es wiederholt die Klage des Lebens labyrinthisch ihren Lauf, and the whole retrospect becomes a delightful picture, the more impressive and suggestive from its landslips, its broken roads, and its waste places. I really think one is repaid for having made oneself quite lonely and deserted and friendless by the pleasure one gets from contemplating one's own situation." "I cannot bear that man," whispered Lady Ambrose to Miss Merton. "Didn't you notice the nasty way in which all that was said? But good gracious, Mr. Laurence, what is that bell ringing for in the house? Is that for us to leave off talking? We have not half done yet." Laurence smiled, and looked a little shy, and murmured that he did not think it was so late. "I don't know whether you'll mind," he said at last, "but our rector is going to give us a little evening service. He proposed it this afternoon in the garden, and I could not well refuse." "Mind it?" exclaimed Lady Ambrose. "I should think not." "Service?" said Dr. Jenkinson briskly. "Yes, come and let us go to that. I think," he said, looking round him, "that you will find the religion we have is the best for us at present. I think so. And Christianity," he added, turning to Mr. Stockton, "really embraces all religions, even any honest denial of itself." There was now a general movement towards the house. "I'm afraid," said Mrs. Sinclair to Leslie, "that you're not of a very happy disposition. You don't look happy, somehow. And yet I think you might be, if you only tried. I suppose you're not out of spirits like Mr. Laurence, because you don't believe in the Trinity, are you? Just look at the sea now. Isn't that beautiful? Don't you care for that? But I, you know," she added with a sigh, "disagree with Mr. Luke. I want the notion of a personal deity to make me enjoy nature. I want my thought to pass away to him. But I don't mean a vague deity, but someone whom I have myself made a deity, and who therefore I can be quite sure exists. Do you see?" "My dear," said Lady Ambrose again to Miss Merton, "I really cannot bear Mr. Leslie. I feel quite sure he's a bad man. And the way he sneers and laughs at things does go so against me. I wouldn't have that man inside my house, do you know, for anything. I know you don't think so, but then you Roman Catholics believe so much you can afford to be liberal. Not that I myself am at all bigoted. Indeed, the one thing I think we want is toleration and charity. And do you know, my dear, Lady Ambrose added as they were entering the house, I have a set of 8 cousins, all unmarried, and when I look at those girls' faces, I do confess, my dear, that I positively wish your religion was true, for then they could all go into convents. One doesn't like those half-and-half Protestant things, you know. Just at this moment, emerging from the house, pale and disappointed, appeared the figure of Mr. Saunders. "It is thrown away!" he exclaimed. "My disproof of God's existence! The under housemaid did it! I am pleased to discover, however, that she previously read through a part, so it has not perished, I trust, without emancipating one spirit. What, are you all going indoors?" "Yes," said Mr. Storks, laying his arm on Mr. Saunders' shoulder. "And you had better come too. Young man," he said in a voice of commanding kindness, "you should never in this virulent way deny God's existence. What rational man believes in it?" "I was looking before dinner," said Mr. Rose, who with Laurence was bringing up the rear, "at the books in your uncle's pavilion in the garden, and I saw there, in a closed case, a copy of the Cultes Secrets des Dames Romaines." "Well," said Laurence a little stiffly, "it has been locked up for years." "I conceived as much," said Mr. Rose gently. "As you do not seem to set much store by the work, I will give you £30 for it." End of Book 4, Chapter 2. Book 5, Chapter 1 of The New Republic by William Hurrell Mallock. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Foon. Once more the theatre was brightly lighted, and once more the congregation was assembled in the tier of boxes. There was not so much excitement as there had been in the morning. Indeed, the reserved decorum that reigned might have been said to partake almost of the nature of apathy. When, however, Dr. Seydon entered, none could deny that he did indeed look a reverend man, and the very aspect of the place seemed to grow devotional at his presence. Lady Ambrose perceived with a full heart that he was duly habited in a surplice, and her bosom warmed with a sense of safety and of comfort as he took his place and solemnly produced his prayer-book. Nor was Lady Ambrose alone in this sudden stir of feeling. There was another of the worshippers who was moved even more strongly, though in a slightly different way. Many starts had been given on the stage in that theatre, but none of these, it may be safely said, ever equalled one now given in the boxes, as Dr. Jenkinson, who had been kneeling with his face hid in his hands, raised his eyes and saw for the first time who it was confronting him. No obscure rural clergyman, as he had anticipated, but that illiberal apologist of superstition, whose officious bigotry had robbed the upper house of its most enlightened spiritual peer. Dr. Jenkinson, however, with the heroism of a true martyr, suffered bravely for his faith in the comprehensiveness of Christianity. His face assumed, in another moment, an expression of cherubic suavity. In his gentlest and devoutest tones he was soon taking his part in the whole service, and that too with such an exquisite clearness of articulation, that, amongst the confused murmurs of the rest, the entire evening office sounded like a duet between him and Dr. Seydon. It is true that there was something in the ring of this one audible voice that gave the latter a sense of something being wrong somewhere, but luckily, being a little short-sighted, he could not recognize the owner of it, and Dr. Jenkinson, feeling no manner of call to endure the sermon, retired furtively as soon as the prayers were over. "Weren't they read beautifully?" said Lady Ambrose to Lady Grace in a whisper. "Oh, how glad I shall be to hear him preach once again," she added as Dr. Seydon, having risen from his knees, retired, his hands clasped before him, through the side door. Lady Ambrose, however, was entirely alone in this gladness. Most of the others dreaded the sermon that was imminent, and some even meditated following Dr. Jenkinson. But events were too quick for them. Hardly, it seemed, had Dr. Seydon left the stalls, than the curtain drew rapidly up, and displayed again the gorge in the Indian Caucasus, only with a preacher in it very different from the one who had stood there in the morning. The whole congregation gave a sudden gasp of surprise. It was not Dr. Seydon that they saw, it was Mr. Herbert. With a gracious gravity he advanced towards the footlights, and made a slight bow to the house, a bow of deprecation and apology. "A little while ago, in the garden," he said, "I confessed to our kind host, Mr. Laurence, that there were a few things that I should like quietly to say to you. And Mr. Laurence has become sponsor for you all, and has promised, in your names, that you would suffer me to say them here. It is true," Mr. Herbert went on, with a smile and a wave of his hand, "that when I look round me at this glittering semicircle, I begin to feel not a little shy of you, and to repent of my own temerity. You, however, have given me today so much good food for reflection, that I feel bound, in the commonest honesty, to make what poor return I can. So remember, that if I weary you, you have really brought it upon yourselves. Well, to begin, then. You think me, you need not deny it, for I know you think me, a somewhat crotchety and melancholy individual, averse to modern knowledge and to modern progress, and seeing, as a rule, everything very yellow indeed, with his jaundiced eyes. But I think myself that I am not by any means so obstinate and so wrong-headed as I am quite aware that I appear to you. Nay, my own opinion is that I err, rather, in not being quite obstinate enough. It is true that I have persistently pointed out that England is at present given over wholly to ignoble pursuits, and is ruining herself with deadly industries. But I have never said hitherto, so far as I know, that we might not rally, and that a brighter future might not be in store for us. Nay, I hailed a piece of news today, with the most unfeigned delight, which seemed an omen to me that such a brighter future actually was in store for us. In a paper that reached me this afternoon, there was a letter on the prospects of the English iron trade. And I read in that letter that 19 foundries in Middlesbrough have been closed within the last 3 months, and the MALLOCK fires in their blast furnaces extinguished. That 10 more foundries in the same place are scarcely able to continue work, and must very shortly be closed likewise. And that the dense smoke cloud that so long has darkened that whole country is beginning to clear away, and will open ere long upon astonished human eyes that have never yet beheld it, the liquid melted blue of the deep wells of the sky. It is quite true that this indication of a reviving prosperity for our country suggests more than it proves. But at any rate it put me this afternoon, when I joined your party, into quite a right and hopeful mood for appreciating your conceptions of a better order of things. It is, in fact, simply to explain my appreciation that I am, in this most unconscionable way, now detaining you. Let me say in the first place, then, how profoundly right I consider the manner in which you set to work, for it is one of the most vital of all truths that in a perfect state all the parts will be perfect, and that if the highest classes be as good as they can be, so also will be all the other classes. And I want to tell you, in the next place, how entirely fair and lovely did all the elements seem to be, out of which you composed for your higher classes their ideal existence. For you gave them every outward grace that could adorn life, and every inward taste and emotion that could enrich it, and every species of intellectual activity that could stimulate it. Your society was indeed to be truly the crème de la crème. It was to be beautiful, and profound, and brilliant, by lovers and theologians and wits and men of science and poets and philosophers and humorists, all men and women of the world, and fit to live in society as well as to educate it. This would indeed be, as was said at dinner, Rome and Athens and Florence at their best, and let me add Paris also, united and reanimated, and enriched by the possession of yet wider knowledge, and the possibilities of freer speculation. That truly is a dazzling picture. But even that is not all. There was your city itself too, of which a lovely glimpse was given us, with its groves, its gardens, its palaces, and its exquisite reproductions of the world's noblest architectures. And all this under our softest English skies, and by our bluest English seas. Ugh! Exclaimed Mr. Herbert, smiling, and clasping his hands gently. How I should like to live in a city like that! I can literally see it now with my mind's eye whilst I am talking. I see its private houses with their wonders of wrought marble. I see its theatres, its museums, its chapels and churches of all denominations, its scientific lecture rooms, and its convents. For what strikes me more forcibly than anything is that all forms of faith and philosophy seem to find here an impartial home, and to unite in animating one harmonious social life. In fact, so vividly do I see this scene, which your words have called up before me, that I want very much, if you will let me, to add one small feature to it myself. It is a very humble detail, this of mine. In the eyes of the men of science, who lead modern thought, it is simply a sanitary matter. It relates to the way in which you shall dispose of your dead. Now in this, at least, you will be surprised to hear I quite keep pace with the times, being a sincere advocate for cremation. And what I should want to do in your city would be to supply it with an establishment, hidden underground, where the bodies of the dead should be turned into gas in properly devised retorts. The gas from each body being received in a small separate gasometer. Above these gasworks, and amongst your fair towers and spires, and your superb institutions and art galleries, I would build a circular domed temple of umbered marble, blind and blank upon the face of it, without carved work, and without window. Only there should be written above the portal, not as in Dante's vision, Per me si va nell'eterno dolore, per me si va tra la perduta gente. But one verse out of our English translation of the Bible, for women and little children to read, and another verse out of a Latin poet, which is, I believe, an equivalent for the original of that translation, for men and scholars to read. The first should be, though after my skin worms destroy this body, yet in my flesh shall I see God. And the other, Queris quo jaceas post obitum loco, quo non nata jacent. and within, around the dark walls, should be a number of separate shrines, like, to use the simile that Dante would have chosen, the stalls in a great stable, and to each shrine there should be a separate gas jet, and when the life of any was over, after the fire had done its work upon the dead body, that man or woman who felt most bitterly the loss of the one that had been, should repair to this temple, to an appointed shrine, and there, in silence kneeling before it, should light the gas jet, and thus evoking for the last time that which was once so loved, and loving, pass, with what thoughts might be, a brief vigil before it, till its flicker grew slowly faint upon the watcher's face, and at length it went out and ended utterly and for ever. And above, over these sanctuaries of bereavement and final leave-taking, there should hang from the domed roof one rude iron lamp, always burning, casting a pale flare upwards upon the darkness. This would be the common lamp of the poor, for whose sake, dying, no one felt bereavement, or whom no one at any rate could find time to say good-bye to, but who thus united together, apart by themselves, would do all that would be at all seemly in them, would remind you mutely and unobtrusively by their joint light, that one thing at least they shared with you, namely death. It is not of the poor, however, that I am mainly thinking now. It is of your higher classes, who have leisure to feel sorrow and all its holy influences. And these, I say, would find in this simple funeral service one that would meet all their diverse needs, and be in tune with all their diverse feelings. It would suit all. For to some it would symbolize an absolute disbelief in any life beyond, and to all the rest it would symbolize a bewildered doubt about any life beyond. For in one or other of these states of mind everyone would be. "Do you deny it?" exclaimed Mr. Herbert, raising his voice suddenly, and looking round the theatre with a passionate anger, at which the whole audience were literally electrified. "Do you deny it?" he exclaimed. "I tell you that it is so. I tell you too that it is your own case, and that in your utopia you have aggravated the evil, and have not remedied it. You are all deniers or doubters, I tell you, every one of you. The deniers, I know, will not contradict me. So at present I need not speak to them. It is to you, the majority, you who will contradict me. You who are so busy with your various affirmations, with your prayers, your churches, your philosophies, your revivals of old Christianities, or your new improvements on them, with your love of justice and humanity and toleration. It is to you that I speak. It is to you that I say that however enlightened and however sure you may be about all other matters, you are darkened and uncertain as to this, whether there really is any God at all who can hear all the prayers you utter to him, or whether there really is any other life at all, where the aspirations you are so proud of will be realized, and where the wrongs you are so pitiful over will be righted. There is not one amongst you who, watching a dead friend flickering for the last time before you in the form of a gas flame, and seeing how a little while and this flame was with you, and again a little while and it was not with you, would be at all sure whether this was really because, as your hearts would suggest to you, it went to the Father, or because, as your men of science would assert to you, it went simply out. Listen to me for a moment, and I can prove that this is so to you. You are rich, and you have leisure to think of things in what light you will, and your life is to a great extent made easy for you by the labour of others. I do not complain of that. There can be no civilization without order, and there can be no order without subordination. Outward good must be apportioned unequally, or there would be no outward goods to apportion. But you, who have the larger share of these, are bound to do something for those who have the less. I say you are bound to do so. Or else, sooner or later, that large share will be taken away from you. Well, and what is it you propose to do? I know your answer. I have heard it 1,000 times. You will educate them. You will teach them. And truly, if you know how to do that properly, you will have done all you need do. But, exclaimed Mr. Herbert, his voice again rising, and quivering with excitement, that is just what you do not know. I am not casting my words at random. Out of your own mouths will I judge you. There never was a time when you talked so much as now about teaching the people, and yet do not you yourselves confess that you cannot agree together as to what to teach them? You can agree about teaching them, I know this too well, countless things that you think will throw light upon life, but life itself you leave a blank darkness upon which no light can be thrown. You say nothing of what is good in it, and of what is evil. Does success in it lie in the enjoyment of bodily pleasures, or in the doing of spiritual duty? Is there anything in it that is right for its own sake, or are all things right only because of their consequences? And seeing that, if we struggle for virtue, our struggles can never be quite successful here, is there any other place where they may have, I do not say their reward, but their consummation? To these questions only two answers can be given, and one must be entirely true, and the other entirely false. But you dare not give either. You are too enlightened. It is true that you can afford to be liberal about these matters. You can afford to consider truth and falsehood equally tolerable. But for the poor man surely it is not so. It must make some difference to him what you teach him, whether your teaching is to open his eyes to his God and to his duty, and so place his noblest happiness in his own hands, or whether it is to open his eyes to those verified utilitarian principles from which he will learn that his own life and labour are only not utterly contemptible, because they conduce to a material well-being in which he himself can have no share. If, with entire belief yourselves, you are prepared to give him the former teaching, why then it is well and good both for him and you. But if not, beware of teaching him at all. You will but be removing a cataract from his mind's eye, that he may stare aghast and piteous at his own poverty and nakedness, or that he may gaze with a wild beast's hunger at your own truly noble prosperity, which he can never taste, save in the wild beast's way. But enough of the poor, enough of this division of happiness. Let me ask you to consider now what sort of happiness there is to divide. I say divide, meaning that you will get the whole of it. And as I have said before, this happiness is very fair in seeming. Knowledge and culture and freedom and toleration, you have told us what fine things all these can do for you. And I admit it myself too. I feel it myself too. Lovely, indeed, to look upon are the faiths, the philosophies, the enthusiasms of the world, the ancient products of the ages, as the sunshine of the modern intellect falls on them. See, they look clearer and brighter and more transparent. See, they form themselves into more exquisite and lucid shapes, more aerial structures. But why? Do not deceive yourselves. It is for a terrible reason. It is because, like a fabric of snow, they are one and all dissolving. Listen, and I will show you that this is so. Aristotle says that what is truly a man's self is the thinking part of him. This, sooner or later, all the other parts obey. sooner or later, willingly or unwillingly. And if this self be base, the whole man will be base. If the self be noble, the whole man will be noble. And as it is with the individual man, so it is with the ages and the generations. They obey their several selves, whatever these selves may be. The world once had a self whose chief spokesman was a Jewish peasant called Jesus, and sooner or later the world followed him. Later on, it had a self whose chief spokesmen were Dominics or Luthers or Loyolas, and in like manner the world followed them. Later still, it had got another self, and the chief spokesmen of this were Voltaire's and Rousseau's. And in each case the world was convinced at heart, consciously or unconsciously, that the vital truths of life were to be sought for only where these selves sought for them. With Jesus and with Luther it sought them in duty and in a turning to the true God. With Voltaire and Rousseau in justice and in a turning from the false God. And now, where do you seek them? Where does the self of your age seek them? Your self, that thinking part of you before which you all either quail or worship. Does it seek them either in justice or loving kindness, or in the vision of the Most High God? No, but in the rotting bodies of dead men, or in the writhing bodies of live cats. And in your perplexity, and your amazed despair, ever and again you cry to it, "What shall we do to be saved? Show us the Father, show us the High and Holy One that inhabiteth eternity." And what does your self answer you? It answers you with a laugh. There is no High and Holy One at all. How say ye then to me, "Show us the Father"? For the earth saith, "He is not with me," and the depth said, "He is not with me," and our filthy phials of decaying animal matter say, "He is not with us." Argal, ye poor foolish seekers, he is nowhere. You may try to escape from your own self, but you cannot. You may try to forget its answer, but you cannot. Loudly you may affirm with your lips, but the importunate denial is ever at your heart. Patriae quis exul secoque fugit. What do you do then in this perplexity, this halting between two opinions? Why, you do this. You try to persuade yourselves that neither opinion is of much moment, that the question cannot be decided absolutely, that it should not be decided absolutely. In fact, that it is one of your chief glories that you leave it undecided. But I tell you, in that case, that though you say you are rich and increased with goods, and have need of nothing, you are, in reality, wretched and miserable and poor and blind and naked. I am not casting my words at random. Again, out of your own mouths will I judge you. All your culture, you say, is based ultimately upon this, a discrimination between right and wrong. True, profoundly true. But will you be able to say what is right and what is wrong any longer, if you don't know for whom anything is right and for whom anything is wrong? Whether it is for men with immortal souls, or only with mortal bodies, who are only a little lower than the angels, or only a little better than the pigs. Whilst you can still contrive to doubt upon this matter, whilst the fabric of the old faith is still dissolving only, life still for you, the enlightened few, may preserve what happiness it has now. But when the old fabric is all dissolved, what then? When all divinity shall have gone from love and heroism, and only utility and pleasure shall be left, what then? Then you will have to content yourselves with complete denial, or build up again the faith that you have just pulled down. You will have to be born again, and to seek for a new self. But suppose we accept denial, you will say. What then? Many deniers have lived noble lives, though they have looked neither for a god nor for a heaven. Think of Greece, you will say to me, and that will answer you. No, but that is not so, and that will not answer me. The Greeks never, in your sense, denied God. They never, in your sense, denied eternal life. Never, because they never knew them. They felt God only. They felt him unconsciously. And in denying the God they knew, they were really affirming the God they felt. But you, do not you deceive yourselves. Do not think you can ever again be as the Greeks. The world's progress has a twofold motion. History moves onwards round some undiscovered centre, as well as round what you consider its discovered axis. And though it seems to repeat itself, it never can repeat itself. The atheism of the modern world is not the atheism of the ancient. The long black night of the winter is not the swift clear night of the vanished summer. The Greek philosopher could not darken his life, for he knew not from what mysterious source the light fell upon it. The modern philosopher does know, and he knows that it is called God, and thus, knowing the source of light, he can at once quench it. What will be left you, then, if this light be quenched? Will art, will painting, will poetry be any comfort to you? You have said that these were magic mirrors which reflected back your life for you. Well, will they be any better than the glass mirrors in your drawing rooms, if they have nothing but the same listless orgy to reflect? For that is all that will be at last in store for you. Nay, that is the best thing that possibly can be in store for you. The only alternative being not a listless orgy for the few, but an undreamed of anarchy for all. I do not fear that, however. Some will be always strong, and some will be always weak. And though if there is no God, no divine and fatherly source of order, there will be, trust me, no aristocracies. There will still be tyrannies. There will still be rich and poor, and that will then mean happy and miserable. And the poor will be, as I sometimes think they are already, but a mass of groaning machinery without even the semblance of rationality. And the rich with only the semblance of it, but a set of gaudy dancing marionettes, which it is the machinery's one work to keep in motion. What, then, shall you do to be saved? Rend your hearts, I say, and do not mend your garments. Seek God earnestly, and peradventure you may still find him, and I, even I, may find him also. For who am I that speak to you? Am I a believer? No, I am a doubter too. Once I could pray every morning, and go forth to my day's labour stayed and comforted. But now I can pray no longer. You have taken my God away from me, and I know not where you have laid him. My only consolation in my misery is that at least I am inconsolable for his loss. Yes, cried Mr. Herbert, his voice rising into a kind of threatening wail. Though you have made me miserable, I am not yet content with my misery. And though I too have said in my heart that there is no God, and that there is no more profit in wisdom than in folly, yet there is one folly that I will not give tongue to. I will not say peace, peace, when there is no peace. I will not say we are still Christians, when we can sip our wine smilingly after dinner, and talk about some day defining the Father. And I will only pray that if such a Father be, he may have mercy alike upon those that hate him, because they will not see him, and on those who love and long for him, although they no longer can see him. Mr. Herbert's voice ceased. The curtain fell. The whirlwind was over. The fire was over. And after the fire, from one of the side boxes came a still, small voice. Very poor taste. Very poor taste. It was perceived that Dr. Jenkinson, having discovered almost immediately who was really to be the preacher, had stolen back silently into the theatre. End of Book 5, Chapter 1. Book 5, Chapter 2 of The New Republic by William Hurrell Mallock. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Foon. The following morning Miss Merton had risen early, and was sauntering slowly before breakfast up and down the broad terrace in front of the house. She inhaled the fresh, delightful air. She looked out over the breezy sea. She scanned the splendid villa, now shining in the sunlight, with its marble porticos, and its long rows of windows, and she thought over yesterday with all its conversations and incidents. In especial, she thought of Lawrence. She thought of him as he was now, and as he has been in former times, when they had known each other so well. And as she thought of him, she sighed. "And he might do so much," she said to herself. "And yet he is so weak and so irresolute, wasting his time in Paris and in London, reading poetry and buying pictures, and talking philosophy he doesn't believe in with his dilettante friends. And this place, this lovely place, how often does he come here? What does he do for his tenants and dependents, for all who ought to look for help to him? I have no patience with a man who keeps moaning about religion as he does, and yet won't act up to the light which he must have." Whilst she was thus meditating, the subject of her meditations appeared upon the terrace. "You are out early," he said. "I have just been seeing Herbert off. He has had to go before everybody else, for he is en route for Italy." "You look very tired," said Miss Merton sympathetically. "Oh, it is nothing," said Lawrence, turning the subject. "Did you notice Leslie last evening in the garden, and how odd his manner was? Do you remember, too, the pretty song he sang the night before, and how surprised we all were at it? Well, I had a letter yesterday, from a friend both of his and mine, which explains it. The heroine of the song was not an ideal young lady, though whether one can call her real any longer is more than I can say. She is dead. I don't know all the story, but my friend just gave me the outline, and enclosed a note for Leslie to tell the news to him himself. He never fancies he feels anything, but what he won't admit to himself, his manner, I am sure admitted to me, and I dare say to you too." "Yes," said Miss Merton thoughtfully. "I felt sure it must be something of that kind. But you," she said, turning to Lawrence, "how utterly tired and worn out you look." "To say the truth," Lawrence answered, "I slept very little last night. I was thinking of our culture and our enlightenment. I was thinking of God knows what. And why should I tell you? I'm sorry," he said, "that we're all breaking up today. I wish we could have kept the party together for a little longer. I don't know what I shall do. I can't stop here. I shan't go to London. I hate London. I had almost resolved, an hour ago, to go off to Italy with Herbert." "By way of finding some duty to do?" asked Miss Merton quietly. "I have no duties," said Lawrence. "Didn't Herbert very truly tell us so last night? But in Italy I should at least forget that I ever might have had any. And I should be then, at any rate, with a congenial friend. Herbert and I, you see, are two fools. We both of us want to pray, and we neither of us can." There was a long pause. At last Miss Merton said with some embarrassment, stooping as she did so to smell a red geranium, I'm sure I wish I could be of any use to you, but really I don't quite see how I can." There was another pause. At last Laurence said in a very low tone, "I cannot pray, because I do not believe in God. Will you pray for me?" Miss Merton turned and looked at him with a soft, serious smile. "I did last night, if you wish very much to know," she said, and her cheek grew slowly tinted with an unconscious blush. "Did you?" exclaimed Laurence with a sudden eagerness. "Then, if you cared enough for me to do that, will you care enough for me to do something far better than praying for me? Will you," he said, pausing and looking at her, "will you—" But at that instant the gong for breakfast sounded, and the sentence died unfinished. Both he and she were perhaps a little grateful for this interruption. It relieved a sudden sense of shyness that had become painful, and to all intents and purposes their looks had already said all that need be said. It might, both felt, be securely left to find its way into words at a more convenient season. In another moment they were in the midst of that most matter-of-fact bustle that precedes in country houses the settling down to breakfast of a large party. "Well, Mr. Laurence," exclaimed Lady Ambrose, "all pleasant things come to an end at last, but this visit to you has really been positively delightful. And now you must be careful not to forget me, that we are expecting you in September in Gloucestershire, to take part in our private theatricals. By the by," she added, sinking her voice to a fit solemnity, "I think I told you, didn't I, how ill the poor Duchess of had been last week, though she's better now, I am happy to hear this morning. Ham, tongue, pigeon pie, omelette," she went on as she sat down at the table. "Why, amongst all this host of good things, I don't know really what to choose. Well, suppose, Mr. Laurence, you were to bring me just the least bit of omelette. My dear," she whispered to Miss Merton, who was on one side of her, "what a dreadful blowing up Mr. Herbert gave us last night, didn't he? Now that, you know, I think is all very well in a sermon, but in a lecture, where the things are supposed to be taken more or less literally, I think it's a little out of place." "Did you say just now," said Leslie, who found himself on the other side of Lady Ambrose, "that the Duchess of was ill?" "Oh, it was just something I was telling Mr. Laurence," said Lady Ambrose coldly. "She is much better now, thank you. Do you know her?" "She's my aunt," said Leslie. Lady Ambrose turned round and looked Leslie full in the face. As she looked, a smile began to dimple her cheek and light up her sweet grey eyes. "You don't say so!" she exclaimed at last. "Why, of course you are! How stupid of me not to have found that out before! To be sure, you are the redoubtable Eton boy, who made such a dreadful commotion at Daleham by wanting to run away with a nursery governess. And to think that I only have discovered you at this last moment, when we are all of us going to say good-bye!" "Your carriage is at the door, my lady," said a servant. "Already?" said Lady Ambrose. "How time flies! Dr. Jenkinson, you and I are going to the train together, I believe. And now, Mr. Leslie," she went on, "Mr. Laurence is coming to us in September for some private theatricals. I don't know if you do anything in that way yourself, but perhaps if you are in England, and have no better engagements, you will come with him. At any rate, if you won't, please to remember I shall think it very ill-natured of you." "Thank you," said Leslie, smiling. "I am not ill-natured." "I am quite ready, Lady Ambrose, if you are," said Dr. Jenkinson briskly. "And now, Laurence," he said, as he was standing in the portico, whilst Lady Ambrose was getting into the carriage, "good-bye. I've had a most pleasant visit. But as to your utopia, your ideal of the future," he added confidentially, "it has been said, foolishly enough, that God was the broken phantom of self, projected on the mists of the non-ego. Well, your utopia was the broken phantom of the present, projected on the mists of the impracticable. It was simply the present with its homelier details left out. Goodbye, goodbye." "Then, in that case," said Laurence, as he bade adieu to the Doctor, "it is a comfort to know from you that the present, as it is the highest state of things conceivable." "Goodbye," said Lady Ambrose, with a smile in her beautiful frank eyes. "Goodbye, Mr. Leslie, and mind that you don't forget September." End of Book 5, Chapter 2. Recording by Foon. End of The New Republic, or Culture, Faith and Philosophy in an English Country House, by William Hurrell Mallock.